Imagine a world where a single man's vision would consume nations, topple empires that had stood for centuries, and create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. A world where the thunder of hooves would be the last sound millions would ever hear, and where the name of one tribe would become synonymous with both terror and unprecedented cultural exchange. This is not fiction. This is the story of how the Mongols reshaped the medieval world in ways we're still feeling today. If you find this deep dive into one of history's most transformative periods valuable or engaging, consider liking this video and subscribing for more historical content. And I'm genuinely curious, which aspect of the Mongol conquests do you find most fascinating? The military tactics, the cultural impact, or perhaps the sheer scale of their achievements? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The year is 1162, and somewhere on the windswept steppes of Mongolia, a child is born who will grow up to become the most feared conqueror in human history. But Temujin, as he was originally named, entered a world that seemed designed to crush him before he could even walk. His father, Yesugei, was poisoned by rival Tatars when Temujin was just 9 years old, leaving his family destitute and abandoned by their own tribe. This wasn't unusual for the Mongol steppes. It was a harsh landscape that bred harsh people, where survival depended on constant vigilance and the ability to strike first. The Mongolia of Temujin's youth was a fractured collection of tribes, each fighting for the same scarce resources: grazing land for their horses and livestock, access to trade routes, and the honor that came with raiding successful neighbors. The Mongols were nomads, living in felt tents called gurs, following their herds across vast grasslands that stretched from the Gobi Desert to the forests of Siberia. They were master horsemen from childhood, learning to ride before they could properly walk, and they lived and died by the rhythm of the seasons and the movements of their animals. But Temujin was different. Even as a child cast out by his own people, even as he and his family scraped by on wild plants and whatever small game they could catch, he possessed something that would prove more valuable than gold or horses: an unshakable belief in his own destiny. Mongol shamans had supposedly declared at his birth that he would become a great leader, noting that he was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign of future warrior prowess. Whether this actually happened or was later mythologized, Temujin certainly believed it, and more importantly, he made others believe it too. His early life reads like a survival manual written in blood. When he was captured by a rival tribe, the Taichiud, and held prisoner in a wooden collar called a kangwe, he escaped by striking his guard with the collar and fleeing into the wilderness. When horse thieves stole his family's animals, essentially their entire livelihood, he tracked them down and recovered the horses, earning the respect and friendship of Jamuka, who would later become both his blood brother and his greatest enemy. These weren't just adventures. They were the forging of a man who understood that in the world of the steppes, only strength mattered, and that strength had to be earned again and again. By his early 20s, Temujin had begun to attract followers. Not just anyone could do this in Mongol society. Leadership wasn't inherited. It was taken. Warriors chose to follow a leader based on his success in battle, his generosity with loot, and his ability to provide protection and opportunities for advancement. Temujin offered something more. He offered a vision of unity that transcended tribal boundaries. While most Mongol leaders were content to raid their neighbors and retreat back to their traditional territories, Temujin spoke of bringing all the tribes under one banner, of ending the endless cycle of revenge killings and petty wars that kept the Mongols weak and divided. This vision put him on a collision course with the established order of the steppes. The most powerful leader at the time was Jamukha, his former blood brother, who commanded a vast confederation of tribes and saw Temujin as a dangerous upstart. The conflict between them wasn't just personal. It represented two different philosophies of Mongol leadership. Jamukha believed in the traditional ways, where tribal identity mattered above all and leaders ruled through fear and the maintenance of ancient grudges. Temujin believed in meritocracy and unity, promoting men based on their abilities rather than their birth, and incorporating defeated enemies into his ranks rather than simply slaughtering them. The war between them lasted for years, a brutal back-and-forth struggle across the steppes. Battles were fought with the fluid tactics that would later terrorize settled civilizations. Rapid cavalry charges, feigned retreats, and the deadly accuracy of composite bows fired from horseback. These weren't the massive clashes of medieval European warfare, with knights in heavy armor smashing into each other in single decisive battles. Steppe warfare was about mobility, endurance, and the ability to appear where your enemy least expected you. One of the defining moments came when Jamukha captured several of Temujin's followers and had them boiled alive in cauldrons, their screams echoing across the steppes as a warning to anyone who would dare support his rival. But rather than terrifying potential followers away from Temujin, this act of cruelty had the opposite effect. Mongol warriors respected strength, but they also valued leaders who protected their men. Jamukha's brutality was seen as a sign of weakness, not strength. A leader secure in his power didn't need to resort to such methods. Temujin's approach was different. When he captured enemies, he often gave them a choice: join him and be treated as equals, or die. Many chose to join, and crucially, he kept his word. Former enemies found themselves promoted to positions of trust and responsibility in his growing army. This wasn't mercy, it was calculated strategy. Every warrior who joined him made his army stronger, and every act of honorable treatment made it more likely that future enemies would surrender rather than fight to the death. The final confrontation came in 1206, when Temujin's forces cornered Jamukha and his remaining followers. By this point, many of Jamukha's own men had deserted him, unwilling to continue a war they saw as already lost. When Jamukha was finally captured, the two former blood brothers met one last time. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the only contemporary Mongol account of these events, Jamukha acknowledged Temujin's victory and asked only for an honorable death. Temujin granted this request, having Jamukha executed without spilling his blood, a mark of respect in Mongol culture, as it was believed the soul resided in the blood. With Jamukha's death, the last major obstacle to Mongol unity was removed. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The name itself is debated by historians, but it likely means something like oceanic ruler, or ruler of all between the oceans. More important than the title was what it represented. For the first time in their history, the Mongol tribes were united under a single leader. But Genghis Khan was just getting started. The unification of the Mongols was not an end in itself, but the beginning of something far more ambitious. The steppes could only support so many people, and the harsh winters and unpredictable climate meant that even in good years, life was precarious. Genghis Khan looked beyond the traditional Mongol territories toward the wealthy sedentary civilizations that bordered the steppes. These settled peoples had something the Mongols desperately needed: agricultural surplus, manufactured goods, and the wealth that came from controlling trade routes. The first target was the Western Xia, a kingdom in what is now northwestern China that controlled crucial sections of the Silk Road. The Western Xia were a Tangut people who had built a sophisticated civilization in the desert regions between Tibet and China proper. They had strong fortifications, a well-organized army, and the backing of the much larger Jin dynasty to their east. By all conventional wisdom, they should have been able to easily repel any attack by nomadic raiders. But Genghis Khan didn't launch conventional raids. The Mongol approach to warfare was unlike anything the settled civilizations had experienced. Instead of besieging cities and trying to conquer territory in the traditional sense, the Mongols focused on destroying the enemy's ability to resist. They would sweep across the countryside, destroying crops, capturing livestock, and terrorizing the rural population. Cities that surrendered were often spared, while those that resisted faced complete destruction. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. The Mongols deliberately cultivated a reputation for ruthlessness, knowing that terror could often accomplish what siege engines could not. Stories spread of entire populations being massacred, of cities being razed so completely that grass grew in their ruins. Some of these stories were exaggerated. The Mongols were actually quite pragmatic about preservation when it served their purposes. But the effect was real. Many cities surrendered without a fight rather than face the possibility of total annihilation. The Western Xia campaign, which began in 1209, established the pattern that would be repeated across Eurasia. The Mongols would demand submission and tribute, and if this was refused, they would launch a campaign of systematic devastation. The Tangut forces, despite their fortifications and numerical advantages, found themselves unable to cope with an enemy that refused to fight by the established rules. Mongol armies could appear suddenly, strike hard, and disappear before conventional forces could respond. Their mobility was their greatest weapon. They could cover vast distances at speeds that seemed impossible to their enemies. By 1227, the Western Xia had been completely conquered, but the campaign had taken its toll on Genghis Khan himself. He died during the final phase of the conquest, possibly from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse, though the exact circumstances remain mysterious. His death could have ended the Mongol expansion before it really began, but instead it marked the beginning of an even more systematic and devastating phase of conquest. Genghis Khan had spent his final years not just conquering territory, but building the institutional framework that would allow the Mongol Empire to survive and expand long after his death. He divided his empire among his sons, but unlike many succession arrangements that led to immediate civil war, the Mongol system actually worked. Each son received a specific region to govern, but they all remained subordinate to the Great Khan, a position that passed to Ögedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor. Ögedei was different from his father, less charismatic perhaps, but more administratively minded. Where Genghis Khan had been a brilliant military leader and unifier, Ögedei was a systematic empire builder. He established the Mongol capital at Karakorum, created a regular postal system that connected the far reaches of the empire, and most importantly for the continuation of conquest, he organized the Mongol military machine into an efficient instrument of expansion. The next major target was the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China and represented one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. This was a far more formidable opponent than the Western Xia. The Jin had a population in the tens of millions, sophisticated military technology, including gunpowder weapons, and centuries of experience in dealing with nomadic raiders. Their capital, Zhongdu, modern Beijing, was one of the largest and most heavily fortified cities in the world. The campaign against the Jin, which began in earnest in 1211, revealed the true evolution of Mongol military tactics. While they retained their traditional advantages of mobility and archery, they had also begun to incorporate new technologies and techniques learned from their conquered subjects. Chinese engineers were employed to build siege engines, and captured Jin soldiers were often pressed into service in Mongol armies. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about combining the best elements of nomadic and sedentary military traditions. The siege of Zhongdu in 1215 demonstrated this new approach. Rather than simply surrounding the city and waiting for starvation to do their work, the Mongols employed sophisticated siege techniques, including the use of catapults and early gunpowder weapons. They also used psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale, making sure that refugees from the surrounding countryside spread stories of Mongol ruthlessness throughout the city. The combination of military pressure and psychological terror proved effective. Zhongdu fell after a brutal siege, and its capture marked the effective end of Jin resistance in northern China. But even as the Mongols were consolidating their control over northern China, they were already looking westward. The Khwarezmid Empire, which controlled much of Central Asia and modern-day Iran, had made the fatal mistake of attacking a Mongol trade caravan and killing the envoys Genghis Khan had sent to negotiate. In Mongol culture, envoys were sacred, their safety was guaranteed by ancient custom, and their murder was seen as the gravest possible insult. The Mongol response was swift and devastating. In 1219, Genghis Khan personally led an army of around 200,000 warriors westward, beginning what would become one of the most destructive military campaigns in human history. The Khwarezmid Empire was rich and populous, with great cities like Samarkand and Bukhara that were centers of Islamic learning and trade. The Khwarezmid Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, commanded armies that outnumbered the Mongols and had the advantage of fighting on familiar terrain behind strong fortifications. None of it mattered. The Mongol approach to the Khwarezmid campaign was systematic annihilation. Cities that surrendered immediately might be spared the worst, but any resistance was met with complete destruction. The siege of Otrar, where the original caravan had been attacked, set the tone. After the city fell, every inhabitant was killed, and the city was razed so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt. The governor who had ordered the attack on the caravan was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. The psychological impact of Otrar's destruction rippled across Central Asia. When the Mongol army approached Bukhara, one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, the garrison fled rather than face siege. The city's leaders opened the gates and formally surrendered. Genghis Khan rode into the main mosque and declared to the assembled population that he was the punishment of God sent to chastise them for their sins. The city was then systematically looted, though the population was largely spared. Samarkand, another great center of Islamic civilization, chose to resist. The siege lasted only 5 days, but its aftermath was catastrophic. According to contemporary accounts, the entire population of several 100,000 was massacred, with only a few craftsmen spared to be sent back to Mongolia. The city itself was so thoroughly destroyed that it remained largely uninhabited for generations. The speed of the Mongol advance was as terrifying as its thoroughness. Traditional armies moved slowly, burdened by supply trains and siege equipment. Mongol armies lived off the land and off their enemies, moving at the speed of their horses. They could appear before a city's walls before news of their approach had even reached the defenders. This mobility allowed them to defeat enemies in detail. conquering cities and regions before they could coordinate their defenses. By 1221, the Khwarezmid Empire had effectively ceased to exist. The Shah had fled and died in exile, his armies were scattered or destroyed, and his greatest cities lay in ruins. But the Mongol expansion was far from over. Subutai and Jebi, two of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, led a reconnaissance force further west, crossing the Caucasus Mountains and emerging into the steppes of what is now southern Russia and Ukraine. This expedition, originally intended as just a large-scale raid, accidentally triggered the Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe. The Cumans, a Turkic people who controlled much of the western steppe, fled before the Mongol advance, seeking refuge with their sometimes allies, the Kievan Rus. The Russian princes, seeing an opportunity to permanently solve their Cuman problem, allied with the refugees and marched out to meet the Mongols at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. The Battle of the Kalka River was a disaster for the Rus. The combined Russian and Cuman army outnumbered the Mongols significantly, but they had never faced an enemy like this. Mongol tactics of feigned retreat and rapid maneuver confused and scattered the Allied army, and what had begun as a confident advance turned into a rout. Thousands of Russian nobles were killed, and the survivors brought back tales of an invincible enemy from the eastern steppes. But this was just a preview. Subutai and Jebe's force was relatively small, and after their victory, they disappeared back into the steppes, leaving the Russians to wonder if they had dreamed the whole encounter. It would be more than a decade before the Mongols returned in force, but when they did, they would bring with them the full weight of the expanding empire. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 had created a brief pause in westward expansion as the Mongols dealt with succession issues and consolidated their control over their existing conquests. But under Ögedei Khan, the expansion resumed with even greater systematization. The Mongol Empire was now vast enough to support multiple simultaneous campaigns, and the wealth flowing in from conquered territories provided the resources needed for ever larger military expeditions. The completion of the Jin conquest in 1234 freed up enormous numbers of Mongol warriors for campaigns elsewhere. At the same time, the incorporation of Chinese military technology and administrative expertise made the Mongol military machine more sophisticated than ever. Siege warfare, once a weakness for the nomadic Mongols, became one of their strengths as Chinese engineers provided them with advanced catapults, early cannon, and other technologies unknown in the West. In 1237, Batu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, led a massive Mongol army westward into the lands of the Rus. This was no mere raid. It was a systematic campaign of conquest intended to permanently incorporate Eastern Europe into the Mongol Empire. The army was enormous by medieval standards, possibly numbering 150,000 warriors, and it was supported by an even larger number of engineers, administrators, and support personnel. The first target was the city of Ryazan, which had refused to pay the tribute demanded by Mongol envoys. The siege lasted only 6 days, and its aftermath was typical of Mongol practice when faced with resistance. The city was completely destroyed, its population massacred, and its prince killed. The destruction was so complete that Ryazan was never rebuilt. Its ruins served as a warning to other Russian cities of what awaited those who defied the Mongols. Moscow, at this time still a minor city, surrendered without resistance and was spared destruction. This pragmatic decision by Moscow's leaders would prove to be one of the most important in Russian history. Moscow's survival and eventual rise to prominence was partly due to its early accommodation with Mongol rule. The great prize was Kiev, the mother of Russian cities and the political and religious center of the Rus. Kiev had massive walls, a large garrison, and the psychological advantage of being considered impregnable by its defenders. When the Mongol army arrived in late 1240, the siege that followed showcased the full evolution of Mongol siege warfare. Chinese-designed catapults hurled massive stones at the city walls, while early gunpowder weapons created explosions that terrified defenders who had never experienced such warfare. The siege lasted several months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. When Kiev finally fell in December 1240, the destruction was so complete that a visitor 6 years later found only 200 houses standing in what had once been one of Europe's greatest cities. The Kiev that had been the center of Orthodox Christianity and Russian culture was effectively erased from history. But the Mongols weren't finished. Hungary and Poland lay beyond the Russian lands, and both were seen as natural extensions of the steppe environment that the Mongols preferred. The Hungarian plain in particular seemed almost designed for Mongol-style warfare. Vast grasslands perfect for their horse-based military system. The invasion of Hungary and Poland in 1241 demonstrated the Mongol ability to coordinate multiple campaigns across vast distances. While Batu Khan led the main army into Hungary, other Mongol forces simultaneously invaded Poland, ensuring that neither kingdom could send aid to the other. This level of strategic coordination was unprecedented in medieval warfare and showed how the Mongol military machine had evolved from the tribal raiding parties of Genghis Khan's youth. The Battle of Mohi in Hungary was perhaps the most complete Mongol victory in Europe. The Hungarian army, led by King Bela IV, was one of the most formidable military forces in medieval Europe, with heavy cavalry that had proven effective against other enemies. But against the Mongols, traditional European tactics proved useless. Mongol mobility allowed them to surround and isolate portions of the Hungarian army, while their archery tore apart cavalry charges before they could reach Mongol lines. The aftermath of Mohi was typical of Mongol practice. The Hungarian army was virtually annihilated. King Bela fled into exile, and Mongol forces spread across the Hungarian plain, destroying cities and devastating the countryside. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that Hungary had been transformed into a desert, its population killed or fled. In Poland, the results were similar. The Battle of Legnica saw the destruction of a combined Polish and German army, with the Mongols reportedly collecting 9 sacks of ears cut from the corpses of their enemies. The psychological impact of these victories rippled across Europe. Here was an enemy that seemed unstoppable, that fought in ways that made traditional medieval warfare obsolete. By late 1241, Mongol forces were preparing to invade the Holy Roman Empire itself. Scouts had already crossed into Austria, and Emperor Frederick II was desperately trying to organize a pan-European crusade against the Mongol threat. The Western European kingdoms, which had spent centuries fighting each other, suddenly faced the possibility of conquest by an alien force from the eastern steppes. Then, suddenly, the invasion stopped. News reached the Mongol commanders that Ogedei Khan had died in Karakorum, and Mongol law required all members of the royal family to return for the election of a new great Khan. Batu Khan, despite being on the verge of what might have been the conquest of all Europe, turned his armies around and began the long march back to Mongolia. This withdrawal saved Western Europe from Mongol conquest, but it was only a temporary reprieve. The Mongols established permanent control over the territories they had already conquered, creating the Golden Horde that would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries. The withdrawal also demonstrated something crucial about the Mongol Empire. Despite its vast size, it remained unified by shared institutions and laws that took precedence over individual campaigns. The election of Mengke Khan as the new Great Khan in 1251 marked the beginning of the final phase of Mongol expansion. Mengke was a systematic ruler who organized simultaneous campaigns against the Song dynasty in southern China and the Islamic world in the Middle East. These weren't opportunistic raids, but carefully planned conquests intended to bring the remaining major civilizations of Eurasia under Mongol control. The campaign against the Islamic world was led by Hulagu Khan, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons. The primary target was the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, which remained one of the great powers of the Islamic world despite centuries of political fragmentation. Baghdad was not just a political center, but the intellectual and cultural heart of Islam, home to the House of Wisdom, where scholars had preserved and expanded upon Greek philosophy and science. The Mongol approach to this campaign was methodical. Rather than simply attacking Baghdad directly, Hulagu first systematically eliminated the various Ismaili strongholds throughout Persia, including the famous fortress of Alamut, headquarters of the assassins. These campaigns served both strategic and psychological purposes. They eliminated potential threats to Mongol supply lines while demonstrating the futility of resistance. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 was one of the most culturally devastating events in medieval history. The city had resisted Mongol demands for submission, and Caliph al-Mustasim had apparently believed that the entire Islamic world would rally to defend the seat of the caliphate. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. When Baghdad fell after a brief siege, the destruction was systematic and complete. The caliph was executed, reportedly by being rolled in carpets and trampled by horses to avoid spilling his blood directly. More devastating than the political destruction was the cultural loss. The House of Wisdom, with its irreplaceable collection of manuscripts, was destroyed. Books were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water reportedly ran black with ink. Centuries of Islamic scholarship and learning were lost in a matter of days. The destruction of Baghdad marked the effective end of the Islamic Golden Age and shifted the center of Islamic civilization westward to Cairo and Damascus. Meanwhile, in China, Mengke Khan personally led the campaign against the Song dynasty, the last major Chinese state to resist Mongol rule. The Song were a formidable opponent. They had gunpowder weapons more advanced than anything the Mongols had previously encountered, a sophisticated navy that controlled China's rivers and coastline, and a population that numbered in the tens of millions. The Song campaigns revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Mongol military system. In the open field, Song armies were no match for Mongol mobility and tactics. But Song cities, protected by advanced fortifications and defended by gunpowder weapons, proved much more difficult to conquer than anything the Mongols had previously faced. The siege of Xiangyang, for example, lasted 5 years and required the Mongols to essentially learn naval warfare from scratch. Mengke Khan's death during the campaign in 1259 led to another succession crisis, but this time the unity of the Mongol Empire began to fracture. The election of Kublai Khan as Great Khan was disputed by his younger brother Arik Böke, leading to a civil war that lasted until 1264. Although Kublai Khan ultimately prevailed, the civil war marked the beginning of the empire's fragmentation into separate khanates that were often more concerned with their own regional interests than with maintaining imperial unity. Despite these internal conflicts, the momentum of conquest continued. Kublai Khan completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in 1279, finally bringing all of China under Mongol rule and establishing the Yuan dynasty. This achievement represented the culmination of nearly 7 decades of Mongol expansion in East Asia and created the largest unified Chinese state in history up to that point. But Kublai Khan's ambitions extended beyond China. In 1274 and again in 1281, he launched massive naval invasions of Japan, seeking to add the island kingdom to his empire. These campaigns revealed the limits of Mongol adaptability. Their traditional advantages of mobility and archery were less effective in naval warfare, and both invasion fleets were destroyed by typhoons that the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine wind. The failed Japanese invasions were part of a broader pattern of Mongol expansion reaching its natural limits. Campaigns in Southeast Asia against the kingdoms of Burma, Vietnam, and Java met with mixed success at best. The tropical climate, unfamiliar terrain, and determined resistance of local populations proved that even the Mongol military machine had its limitations. By 1300, the great age of Mongol conquest was essentially over. The empire had grown too large to be effectively governed as a single unit, and it had begun to fragment into separate khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each of these successor states gradually adopted the cultures and religions of their subjects, losing the distinctive characteristics that had made the original Mongol conquests possible. The impact of the Mongol conquests on world history cannot be overstated. In purely military terms, they represented the last great nomadic conquest of sedentary civilizations, demonstrating that traditional advantages of fortification and numerical superiority could be overcome by superior mobility, tactics, and organization. The Mongols forced a revolution in military thinking that influenced warfare for centuries afterward. Culturally, the Mongol Empire created the first truly global trade network, connecting Europe, Asia, and the Middle East in ways that had never been possible before. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, made it safe for merchants and ideas to travel across vast distances. Technologies like gunpowder, printing, and the compass spread westward along Mongol trade routes, while Islamic astronomical knowledge and European innovations moved eastward. The demographic impact was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that the Mongol conquests resulted in the deaths of approximately 40 million people, representing roughly 11% of the world's population at the time. Entire regions were depopulated, and some areas didn't recover their pre-conquest population levels for centuries. The destruction of cities like Kiev, Baghdad, and Samarkand eliminated centuries of accumulated culture and learning. Yet the Mongol Empire also facilitated an unprecedented exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The Mongols were remarkably tolerant of different religions and cultures, often adopting useful practices from their subjects while allowing conquered peoples to maintain their traditional ways of life. This pragmatic approach to governance created a cosmopolitan empire where a Chinese engineer might serve alongside a Persian administrator under the command of a Mongol general. The legal and administrative innovations of the Mongol Empire also had lasting impact. The Mongol legal code, the Yasa, established principles of religious tolerance and meritocracy that were far ahead of their time. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, created the first efficient long-distance communication network in human history, enabling coordination across distances that had previously been unimaginable. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol conquests fundamentally altered the balance of world civilizations. The destruction of Baghdad ended the Islamic Golden Age and shifted the center of Islamic civilization westward. The conquest of China created the conditions for the Ming dynasty's later maritime expeditions and cultural flowering. The devastation of Eastern Europe created a power vacuum that was eventually filled by the rise of Moscow as the center of a new Russian state. The Mongol conquests also had profound effects on European development. The temporary threat of Mongol invasion forced European kingdoms to develop new military technologies and tactics. The flow of Asian goods and technologies through Mongol trade networks stimulated European interest in direct trade with Asia, ultimately leading to the Age of Exploration. Some historians argue that the Mongol Empire's demonstration of what was possible with unified leadership and systematic organization influenced later European empire-building efforts. In China, the Mongol period led to significant cultural synthesis. The Yuan dynasty saw the flourishing of Chinese literature and drama, partly because traditional Confucian career paths were blocked for ethnic Chinese, forcing talented individuals to seek expression through other means. The Mongol period also saw significant technological advancement, including improvements in printing, metallurgy, and agricultural techniques. The religious impact of the Mongol conquests was equally significant. The Mongols' policy of religious tolerance allowed for unprecedented interactions between different faith traditions. Buddhism spread westward along Mongol trade routes, while Islam expanded eastward. Christianity, both Nestorian and Catholic, found new audiences in Asia. This religious interchange contributed to the development of syncretic belief systems and influenced theological development across multiple traditions. The environmental impact of the Mongol conquests was also substantial. The depopulation of large areas led to the reforestation of abandoned agricultural land, which may have contributed to the climate cooling of the Little Ice Age. The Mongol emphasis on pastoral nomadism over agriculture in some regions altered land use patterns for centuries. At the same time, the expanded trade networks facilitated the spread of crops and agricultural techniques, contributing to global food security in some regions. The Mongol conquests also marked a crucial transition in the nature of warfare and political organization. They represented the last great success of nomadic military organization against sedentary civilizations, but they also demonstrated the importance of incorporating the best elements of different military traditions. The Mongol Empire's administrative innovations, particularly in taxation, communication, and military organization, provided models that influenced later empires across Eurasia. The legacy of the Mongol conquests in terms of historical methodology is also worth noting. The Mongols created or preserved some of the most important historical sources for medieval Eurasia, including the secret history of the Mongols and various Chinese, Persian, and Arabic chronicles. These sources provide unique insights into medieval warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that would otherwise be lost to history. The genetic impact of the Mongol conquests has become apparent only with modern DNA analysis. Studies suggest that a significant percentage of the population across the former Mongol Empire shares common genetic markers, likely reflecting the demographic changes brought about by conquest, resettlement, and the Mongol elite's practice of taking multiple wives from different ethnic groups. The Mongol conquests also established patterns of East-West interaction that persisted long after the empire's fragmentation. The trade routes established during the Mongol period continued to function for centuries, facilitating ongoing cultural and technological exchange. The diplomatic practices developed by the Mongols, including the use of paper money, diplomatic immunity, and systematic intelligence gathering, influenced statecraft across Eurasia. In terms of urban development, the Mongol conquests had contradictory effects. While many cities were destroyed during the initial conquests, the Mongols also founded new cities and expanded others. Karakoram, the Mongol capital, became a cosmopolitan center where representatives of dozens of cultures interacted. Cities like Beijing were transformed and expanded under Mongol rule, setting the stage for their later prominence. The agricultural impact varied by region. In some areas, Mongol rule led to the abandonment of agriculture in favor of pastoralism, contributing to long-term environmental degradation. In other regions, particularly China, Mongol investment in infrastructure, including canals and irrigation systems, enhanced agricultural productivity. The Mongols' global perspective also facilitated the spread of new crops and farming techniques across their empire. The Mongol period also saw significant developments in navigation and cartography. The need to coordinate activities across vast distances led to improvements in map-making and navigation techniques. Mongol-sponsored expeditions expanded geographical knowledge, and the empire's records provide valuable information about medieval geography and climate. As the Mongol Empire fragmented in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, its various successor states evolved in different directions. The Yuan dynasty in China maintained many Mongol traditions while gradually adopting Chinese governmental practices. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam and became increasingly Persianized. The Golden Horde in Eastern Europe maintained its nomadic character longer, but eventually settled and adopted local customs. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained the most traditionally Mongol in character. The ultimate dissolution of Mongol power came gradually through internal fragmentation, external pressure, and cultural assimilation rather than dramatic military defeat. By 1400, the last remnants of Mongol political power were confined to Mongolia itself, and even there, traditional Mongol unity had given way to tribal fragmentation, reminiscent of the pre-Genghis Khan period. The Black Death, which spread along the same trade routes that the Mongols had established, marked the symbolic end of the Mongol era. The pandemic devastated populations across the former Mongol Empire and disrupted the trade networks that had been the empire's economic foundation. The demographic catastrophe of the plague, combined with political fragmentation and climatic changes, ended the conditions that had made the Mongol conquests possible. Yet the memory of the Mongol Empire lived on in ways both obvious and subtle. In Russia, the period of Mongol rule was remembered as the Mongol yoke, a time of oppression that nonetheless helped forge Russian national identity. The administrative practices developed under Mongol rule influenced Russian governance for centuries, and the Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia in later centuries followed many of the same patterns established by the Mongols. In China, the Mongol period was incorporated into the traditional dynastic cycle as the Yuan dynasty, but its impact on Chinese culture was profound and lasting. The Yuan period saw the development of Chinese drama and the novel as distinct literary forms, partly because traditional career paths through the imperial examination system were limited for ethnic Chinese. The Mongol emphasis on practical knowledge over classical learning also influenced Chinese educational philosophy. In the Islamic world, the memory of the Mongol conquests remained traumatic for centuries. The destruction of Baghdad and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate represented a fundamental break in Islamic history, forcing Islamic civilization to reinvent itself around new centers of power in Cairo, Damascus, and eventually Istanbul. The Mongol period also saw the conversion of many Mongols to Islam, creating new dynamics within the Islamic world. The influence of Mongol legal and administrative practices extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries. The concept of diplomatic immunity, the use of paper money, and systematic record-keeping all spread from Mongol innovations. The Mongol postal system provided a model for later communication networks, while Mongol military tactics influenced warfare across Eurasia for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the Mongol Empire demonstrated that unified political control over vast territories was possible, even with medieval technology. This lesson was not lost on later empire builders, from the Ottomans to the Russians to the various European colonial powers. The Mongol model of incorporating useful practices from subject peoples while maintaining central control became a template for imperial governance. The environmental legacy of the Mongol conquests is still being understood by modern scholars. The depopulation of large areas led to significant changes in land use and vegetation patterns that persisted for centuries. Some regions that were heavily forested before the Mongol conquests remained grassland for hundreds of years afterward. The Mongol preference for pastoral nomadism over agriculture in some regions contributed to long-term ecological changes. The cultural synthesis that occurred during the Mongol period had lasting effects on art, literature, and philosophy across Eurasia. Persian miniature painting incorporated Chinese techniques learned during the Mongol period. Chinese art showed Islamic influences that entered through Mongol trade networks. European art and literature were influenced by Asian motifs and themes that arrived through Mongol established trade routes. The Mongol Empire's impact on the development of capitalism and global trade networks was also significant. The Mongol emphasis on trade and their protection of merchants helped establish commercial practices and financial instruments that were later adopted by European traders. The concept of free trade zones, standardized weights and measures, and international commercial law all had precedents in Mongol practice. Modern genetics has revealed another lasting legacy of the Mongol conquests. DNA studies suggest that millions of people across Asia carry genetic markers associated with the Mongol expansion, indicating the profound demographic impact of the conquests. This genetic legacy provides physical evidence of the scope and scale of Mongol influence that complements historical records. The Mongol Empire also left a lasting impact on the development of historical consciousness. The scope of the Mongol conquests forced historians to think in terms of world history rather than merely regional or national narratives. The Mongol period represents one of the first truly global historical phenomena, requiring scholars to consider connections and interactions across vast distances and between diverse cultures. In terms of military history, the Mongol conquests mark the end of an era. They represented the last time that nomadic military organization could successfully challenge and defeat the combined forces of sedentary civilizations. After the Mongol period, improvements in gunpowder weapons, fortification techniques, and military organization gave permanent advantages to settled peoples. The age of great nomadic conquests was over. The linguistic impact of the Mongol Empire was also substantial. Mongol languages left loanwords in dozens of other languages across Eurasia. More importantly, the Mongol Empire facilitated linguistic contact between previously isolated language families, contributing to the development of pidgin languages and influencing grammatical and lexical development across the empire. The Mongol Empire's approach to governance, combining central authority with local autonomy, emphasizing practical results over ideological purity, and incorporating the best practices from different traditions provided a model that influenced political thought for centuries. The concept of pragmatic authoritarianism, where effective governance takes precedence over theoretical consistency, can be traced back to Mongol administrative practices. The technological diffusion facilitated by the Mongol Empire had profound long-term consequences. The westward spread of gunpowder, printing, and the compass through Mongol trade networks ultimately contributed to the European age of exploration and the scientific revolution. Similarly, the eastward spread of Islamic astronomical knowledge and mathematical techniques contributed to developments in Chinese science and technology. The Mongol Empire's religious tolerance, while pragmatically motivated, also had lasting effects on religious development across Eurasia. The interaction between different religious traditions under Mongol rule contributed to theological development and the emergence of syncretic belief systems. The Mongol period saw unprecedented dialogue between Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and traditional shamanic beliefs. The collapse of the Mongol Empire also had significant consequences. The fragmentation of the unified trade network contributed to the economic stagnation of Central Asia, which became increasingly peripheral to global trade as maritime routes developed. The end of Mongol unity also contributed to the rise of new regional powers and the development of the modern state system. The memory of the Mongol Empire continued to influence political and cultural development long after its dissolution. In Mongolia itself, the legacy of Genghis Khan remained a source of national pride and identity. In China, the Mongol period became part of the historical narrative of dynastic succession. In Russia, the Mongol period was remembered as a formative experience that helped shape Russian political culture. The Mongol conquests also established patterns of Eurasian interaction that persisted into the modern period. The trade routes, diplomatic practices, and cultural exchanges initiated during the Mongol period created lasting connections between East and West. Even as political unity dissolved, the cultural and economic integration achieved during the Mongol period provided a foundation for later developments. The study of the Mongol Empire has also contributed to our understanding of pre-modern globalization. The Mongol period demonstrates that extensive cultural, economic, and technological exchange was possible even with medieval transportation and communication technology. This historical example provides valuable perspective on contemporary discussions about globalization and cultural interaction. The environmental history of the Mongol Empire provides insights into the relationship between political organization, economic activity, and ecological change. The Mongol emphasis on mobility and adaptability allowed them to exploit different ecological niches effectively. But their military campaigns also caused significant environmental disruption through population displacement and changes in land use patterns. The demographic recovery from the Mongol conquests took centuries in many regions and was often incomplete. Some areas that were major population centers before the Mongol conquests never regained their former prominence. This demographic reshuffling had lasting effects on regional development patterns and cultural geography across Eurasia. The Mongol Empire's influence on the development of international law and diplomacy was also significant. Mongol practices regarding diplomatic immunity, treaty-making, and the treatment of foreign merchants provided precedents for later international legal development. The Mongol emphasis on written agreements and systematic record-keeping contributed to the development of formal diplomatic procedures. As we reach the end of this comprehensive examination of the Mongol conquests, it's worth reflecting on the sheer magnitude of what was accomplished in roughly a century and a half. from the unification of the Mongol tribes under Genghis Khan to the fragmentation of the empire in the late 13th century, the Mongols created and ruled the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They connected East and West in ways that had never been possible before, facilitating exchanges of goods, ideas, and technologies that shaped the course of world history. The human cost was enormous. Millions died in the conquests, entire cities were destroyed, and some regions were so devastated that they never fully recovered. Yet the Mongol Empire also created conditions for unprecedented cultural exchange, technological diffusion, and economic integration. The tension between destruction and creation, between local devastation and global connection, makes the Mongol Empire one of the most complex and significant phenomena in world history. The legacy of the Mongol conquests extends far beyond military history. Their impact on trade, technology, culture, religion, law, and governance influenced the development of civilization across Eurasia for centuries. Understanding the Mongol Empire is essential for understanding how our modern interconnected world came to be, because in many ways, the Mongols created the first truly global empire and demonstrated both the possibilities and the costs of world-spanning political organization. The story of the Mongol conquests reminds us that history is shaped not just by grand ideas and long-term trends, but by the actions of individuals who dare to imagine possibilities that others consider impossible. From Temujin, the abandoned child who became Genghis Khan, to the countless administrators, generals, and ordinary soldiers who built and maintained the vast empire, the Mongol conquests were ultimately a human achievement, with all the complexity, contradiction, and consequence that human achievement entails. Their story continues to resonate today because it addresses fundamental questions about power, organization, cultural interaction, and the costs of ambition that remain relevant in our own interconnected age. The Mongols showed that the world could be unified, but they also showed the price of such unification. Their empire connected civilizations, but it also destroyed them. Their legacy enriched human culture, but it was built on unprecedented human suffering. In the end, the Mongol conquests represent both the potential and the tragedy of human ambition on a world historical scale. They remind us that transformative change is possible, that established powers can be overthrown, and that the world can be remade in a single generation. But they also remind us that such transformation comes at a cost that we must carefully consider as we shape our own interconnected world. If you found this deep dive into the Mongol conquests enlightening, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more content exploring the pivotal moments that shaped our world. The story of how a group of nomadic tribes from the steppes of Mongolia came to rule the largest empire in human history offers lessons about leadership, adaptation, and the unpredictable nature of historical change that remain relevant today. What aspects of this incredible historical saga resonated most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below.